The day I wore that white dress should have been the happiest day of my life. And it was. For exactly 6 hours. Because after the reception ended, after the flowers wilted, after the last guest smiled and left, I overheard something I was never supposed to hear. 2 voices, behind a half-closed door. My mother-in-law's voice, low and sharp like broken glass. And my new husband's voice, calm. Too calm, for someone who had just promised me forever. I pressed my back against the cold wall, barely breathing. "She doesn't know anything yet," Daniel said. "Good. Keep it that way until the papers are signed," his mother replied. I didn't understand. Not fully. Not yet. But something cold and terrible crept into my chest that night. A feeling I tried very hard to ignore. My name is Lila. I was 26 when I married Daniel Voss. He was charming, successful, and attentive in all the right ways. His family lived in a beautiful house on the edge of the city, with manicured gardens and polished smiles. They welcomed me warmly. Or so I believed. What I didn't know then was that warmly and genuinely are 2 very different things. My own background was complicated. My parents had separated when I was 7. My mother raised me modestly. Small apartment, careful spending, secondhand books. My father had left for business abroad and slowly drifted out of our lives. I grew up believing he had forgotten us. What I didn't know, what no one told me, was that my father hadn't forgotten. He had simply become someone else entirely. But I'll get to that. First, let me tell you about the in-laws. Margaret Voss was the kind of woman who smiled with her teeth, but never with her eyes. From the very beginning, she found small ways to remind me that I wasn't quite enough. A sideways comment about my family background. A subtle correction in front of guests. A gift returned by mistake. Nothing dramatic enough to confront. Just enough to keep me. I didn't confront Daniel that night. Or the next. I've learned something important since then. The most powerful thing you can do when someone betrays you is not react. Not yet. Instead, I started paying attention. I watched the way Margaret's eyes would flick to Daniel's whenever I mentioned my father. I noticed how Richard would subtly steer conversations toward inheritance law, toward family wealth consolidation, toward what happens to assets when families merge. They were rehearsed, patient, practiced. And Daniel, the man I had fallen in love with, was the lead actor in their play. I began to understand the shape of it, piece by piece. My father, Hassan Mercer, had made his fortune in international real estate and private equity. He had been almost entirely absent from my life. A ghost. A wound. A name my mother would sometimes whisper with a complicated expression. But apparently, in the world of high finance, Hassan Mercer was a very well-known name. And someone close to Richard Voss, had discovered something extraordinary. Hassan had no other children, no legitimate heirs. He had, apparently, spent years trying to quietly reconnect with me, the daughter he had abandoned, and had never stopped carrying guilt about. He had even, according to the documents I later found, updated his will. His entire estate. To me. The Voss family had found out, and they had built their entire plan around it. Get Daniel close to me. Earn my trust. Marry me. Then, through a carefully structured marital assets agreement hidden inside our prenuptial paperwork, positioned themselves to claim a portion of anything I inherited. The prenup. The document I had signed with barely a glance because Daniel had said, "It's just a formality, Lila. My parents' lawyer drew it up. It protects both of us." I pulled out my copy the night after.
The morning I chose was a Sunday. Margaret had arranged a family brunch, the kind with fresh flowers and expensive coffee, and conversation carefully designed to feel warm. My father-in-law was discussing a new investment. Daniel was on his phone. I arrived late. I sat down. I poured myself tea. And then I placed a folder on the table. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just quietly, the way you set down something heavy you've been carrying for too long. "I think we should talk," I said. The silence that followed was extraordinary. Margaret looked at the folder, then at me. Something shifted in her expression. A hairline crack in the porcelain composure she always wore. "What is this?" Richard said, reaching for it. "Don't," Daniel said suddenly, low and sharp. Too late. Richard had already seen the top page. His name. The investigator's receipts. The timeline. Daniel looked at me then. Really looked at me. For the first time in months. And I think somewhere inside him he had always known this moment would come. "Lila." "Don't," I said. Just that. One word. My father's legal team had already filed that morning. A fraud complaint. A formal challenge to the prenuptial agreement on grounds of deliberate misrepresentation and concealment. And a separate civil action against Richard Voss for orchestrating the scheme. But the most devastating blow wasn't legal. It was the press release. My father, a man who had spent 20 years operating quietly, who had avoided publicity his entire career, chose that morning to make two public announcements. The first was an official acknowledgement of me as his daughter and sole heir. The second was the launch of the Mercer Foundation, a new charitable initiative focused on protecting vulnerable people from financial predators and inheritance fraud. He named the foundation in my mother's honor. The story was picked up within hours.